Democrats choose their presidential nominee in Kansas is changing next year. What this means for voters and the impact on the race with now 22 candidates. Plus, no debate on Medicaid expansion in the Kansas Senate this week, sparking anger among some Kansans, and another visual demonstration at the State House. And another attempt to change Kansas tax law affecting groceries, internet sales, and your income taxes. That's what we're talking about right now on Kansas Week. Good evening, I'm your host, Pilar Pedraza, and this is Kansas Week. Some had hoped to force a debate on Medicaid expansion in the Senate during this veto session, but that attempt failed to the disappointment of supporters until there was a last-minute Hail Mary effort on Friday morning. KAKE's Greg Miller spoke with those caught in the Medicaid gap about what all this means for them.
Chevy Easter says his disappointment about health care access is too familiar.
Seems like it's just going to get worse from here.
He's a full-time freight broker, single, 25 years old, and has no pre-existing conditions. But because he works for a small company, the cheapest insurance option he says he can find would cost
under like $1,100.
That's right, $1,100 a month.
I've been uninsured for maybe a year, if not close to it. Luckily, I got the exemption code last time when I filed my taxes.
The idea of expanded Medicaid came into focus after the election of Laura Kelly, who campaigned on the issue. Her plan would have expanded health care coverage to 150,000 more Kansans who can't get affordable health insurance. But Senate Republicans shot down the plan Wednesday, saying the policy wasn't ready. In response, Governor Kelly wrote, "There are only two senators, Susan Wagle and Jim Denning, who are preventing a vote on this bill. There are two senators who are preventing 150,000 hardworking Kansans from having access to health care." Wagle said this about the idea last month.
"I believe Medicaid needs reform, not expansion. In Kansas, Medicaid is already struggling to provide those core obligations. Expanding on a failed system that has become too expensive for most Americans is not the answer."
While state lawmakers say the issue can still be discussed and raised next year, Easter admits he'd hoped for something sooner.
Kind of been like this, and it seems like it's just going to get worse from here if nothing's done.
But supporters of Medicaid expansion, tired of waiting, took their concerns to the State House again Friday, dropping dozens of flyers designed to look like past due medical bills, targeting Republican Senate leaders blocking a debate, as the Wichita Eagles' John Shorman showed us on Twitter. And that wasn't the only thing that happened today in the State House as far as all this goes at the point of recording this show. Here to help me discuss all of this, I have Dr. Russell Arvin Fox from Friends University, political scientist, and Dr. Jeffrey Jarman from Wichita State University. Thank you so much. So as we talk about this, I think probably the biggest news on Friday about Medicaid expansion is that there was an effort made in the House. We're going to reject the budget. We're not going to vote on a budget bill that we like. John Carmichael got up and said, "I like this bill, but I'm not going to vote for any budget bill until we have a debate in the Senate on Medicaid expansion." And they got the votes to send the budget back to conference committee for more discussion. My understanding from what I'm hearing out of the State House right now is they're making cuts in that budget bill. Where does it go from here? I mean, this is a political fight we're talking about.
We have to understand this as a purely political fight. It's no longer a policy fight. It is clear that the majority of Kansans, Republicans and Democrats, want Medicaid expansion. It is clear that a majority of state legislatures, both Republicans and Democrats, want Medicaid expansion. The Republican leadership in the Senate, not the House, in the Senate, is preventing, through procedural blockage, a vote on Medicaid expansion from happening. They failed to override that blockage through a procedural maneuver. They were just one vote short of being able to overcome the opposition of the Senate leadership. So now they're trying to apply selective pressure. I really don't think anybody should, be worried about what's going to happen to this budget. They had already fought over it extensively. Yes, there is the possibility that there might be some new negotiations, but if there are, those negotiations are only being engaged in because there are people, again, both Republicans and Democrats, that are trying to force the Republican Senate leadership to allow a vote.
And some of this comes down to optics, too.
Oh, well, I mean, absolutely. I agree. The odds are that this is just politics and time will fix this. But there's a real risk that when they force these votes and when they send the budget back, that the pressure comes in the other direction now, and that there'll be retribution for the real frustrations that people have. And that is an optical problem, you know, whether that looks like the legislators are doing the state's business, doing what the majority of Kansans want, or whether this is just a political fight.
I mean, we've already seen that a lot of the supporters of Medicaid expansion are making this very, very personal with the kind of demonstrations they're having at Topeka. Jim Denning, one of the two senators that Governor Kelly specifically called out, I mean, he's been talking about how, oh, the governor has a vendetta against me, the governor is lining up somebody to challenge me. But this is because he recognizes that his own voters are seeing this and responding to this. You know, he's not some rural conservative, he's not representing some rural conservative district. He's from Johnson County, and he strongly suspects that if he had been up for election in 2018, you know, he might not have gotten it. And so he's looking ahead to 2020, and he's worried about all of this.
He's already got a popular state representative, Cindy Holscher, who said she's going to run against him, and she's a Democrat.
Yep.
And he voted pass, right?
Right.
I mean,
and that is interesting, isn't
right.
it?
I mean, and that goes back to the politics of this, right? Didn't he say a part of it was, well, he's worried about the budget implications because he knows that his voters want this expansion, doesn't want to be on record as voting for or
against.
He don't want to vote for, and he obviously doesn't want to vote against. But
and there's a real concern about timing here. I kind of suspect that one of the reasons why Denning's argument to put this off to 2020 resonates with at least a few Republicans is because they're thinking, we know that our voters want Medicaid expansion, but I also know that a few hardcore conservatives will primary me if I vote for this expansion. So if I put it off to 2020 and we don't have the vote until May of 2020, that kneecaps a lot of people that might possibly primary them in that cycle. Whereas if they vote for expansion now, the hardcore opponents have a whole year to line up someone to go after them.
Well, it's going to be an interesting few hours, if not few days or months. And Medicaid expansion, the debate not going away anytime soon.
The one thing to be clear, I think, about is that even Denning has admitted that he thinks Medicaid expansion is going to happen. He just wants it to happen under his terms. Whereas, you know, Kelly says there are no new terms. We've been arguing about this forever. There's nothing that another year of study will do to change what is already on the table.
And I think that's a argument a lot of folks who support expansion have made this year. All right, well, that's not the only thing they're taking up at the State House this week during the veto session. This latest attempt to change state tax laws came out as a surprise in the Kansas Senate with no warning for many senators, and it had a cost to the state of an estimated $245 million over the next 3 years. Republican leaders brought a new tax cut plan forward during the veto session this week, introducing the legislation and passing it in the Senate within a day. The bill is half the financial size of SB 22, a similar proposal the governor vetoed in March, and legislators didn't attempt to override because they didn't have the votes. But it still includes a key measure Laura Kelly opposed, a deduction that allows multinational corporations to bring profits earned overseas into Kansas untaxed. The bill also would allow taxpayers to itemize their state taxes even if they can't itemize their federal taxes. It also cuts the sales tax on food over several years, the Wichita Eagle says, based on a formula that pays for the cuts with additional revenue collected from taxes on internet purchases. Cutting grocery sales taxes is one of the governor's top priorities. She didn't outright oppose this bill, though others say it's destined for a veto. Instead, she said she's working to form something like the tax review commissions 27 other states have already convened to study Kansas tax policy, what works and what doesn't. She said, like any smart business, state government should consider fundamental questions before pursuing major tax changes. I believe this discussion should be guided by a thoughtful, data-driven, big-picture vision for Kansas, not by a hasty attempt to achieve an immediate political victory, adding she welcomes lawmaker ideas and involvement in the process. And this preference for studying the issue and looking at the data. That is definitely vintage Laura Kelly. As someone who's dealt with her for years when she worked in the Senate, that is definitely the direction she prefers to go. Does that work with politics, though?
Well, you know, in this case, it probably does, because it's also consistent with the way she framed the tax cuts during the campaign that she was running against to try to change that. The idea that it would be a long-term, slower, more methodical approach does slow the effort for some of those reforms that I think fundamentally she opposes anyway. So taking that strategic approach will, almost like we were talking about before, there's a strategy there. Some of these changes really may eventually come, but come under her terms because there are political benefits to doing them that way.
I think there's absolutely a kind of strategy at work here, and we may not know, we might not be able to tell from the news the specifics of that strategy, but she vetoed the previous effort outright, and the Republicans in the legislature knew that they didn't have the votes to overcome that veto. In this case, they've pulled back half of the giveaways that they wanted to provide. Now it's only going to cost the state about $250 million in revenue. And there's, you know, some real improvement in the proposal to reduce the sales tax on food. Now the reduction in the sales tax on food is something that Kelly has absolutely wanted. So I'm wondering, with her language of let's study this out, and I want to hear opinions from the legislators, I wonder if she's got some sort of strategy to say, okay, I can help you salvage some of this if we massage it in the right way, because there's a win for you and a win for me. And maybe she also sees some sort of way to once again, to go back to her primary focus, which is Medicaid expansion, to try to, you know, take some pressure off some Republicans by giving them a win.
Well, I know when I spoke with her right after she vetoed SB 22, she said, there are major parts of this bill that I like. I do think we should decouple from the federal tax law so that Kansans can itemize their state taxes. I do think we should have the income tax or the grocery sales tax reductions. But it was the corporate overseas tax-free giveaway that she was just adamant, no, that's not what Kansas needs.
Yeah, well, and this, I mean, you called it win-win, and I mean, really, the bill does have a little bit for Democrats and Republicans, but the interesting thing is when they talk about it, they're actually talking about each other's arguments. So Republicans are out pushing the bill because of what it does for sales tax on food, while Democrat, right? So there's a win for both sides, but they're attacking the other side for not standing up for their issue.
That's an interesting way to put it, but that's right.
Right. And so again, we've got a political problem, not a policy problem, because they know what they want. It's just hard to get enough votes to push that thing through.
It really does feel like it's gotten much more political in Topeka. And that feels odd to say after the Brownback years, but it does feel like it's gotten more political this last year.
So you do think that, you know, the session of 2019 was more political than, like, say, the session of 2018 or 2017?
Yes.
Is this simply because, in your judgment, that the Republicans are in a position to actually do something now, or rather the Democrats are in a position to do something now, whereas before they weren't? And so that, you know, kind of ratchets things up a little bit?
Well, I think there's definitely a feeling among Democrats in Topeka that, yeah, they do have the ability to do something they haven't been able to before, especially with the, I don't know if I want to call it swing to the left, but swing to support of Democrats in eastern Kansas. They're feeling more strength and pulling at the reins a little bit. At the same time, Republicans are more split. While Republicans have a super majority in Kansas, the fact of the matter is it's really about 2 to 3 different parties that are coalition together, and none of them has the strength to determine exactly which direction we're going to go. And so, yeah, that's my view of it, why there's just a lot more infighting.
I think that's a good assessment.
Yeah, I'd add 2 things. Divided government certainly makes that, you know, ratchets up the need for strategy, because before, over the last several years, we didn't need a strategy, at least for most of these issues. And the other thing really is that what's the famous line from years ago? Elections have consequences. And so you said, is it a swing to the left? It's just a feeling of strength and empowerment, where the Democrats campaigned on some issues and they won on schools, and now school funding is there. They campaigned on Medicaid expansion, and that's where we are today with the fight on the budget.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, the biggest piece of legislation lawmakers still have to get done this year does remain the budget. And as they return for this veto session, the governor wanted an amendment to the bill, adding $30 million for safety. Although with everything that happened on Friday, that might be in trouble, especially compensation and conditions in the Department of Corrections that are so desperately needed.
So after talking to several officers out here who had some concerns about fired officers being offered a job and working here again, we went directly to the warden and he talked to us about it.
Cell Block A remains under restrictive movement at El Dorado, essentially lockdown, so the need for more officers remains critical. Warden Sam Klein confirms they are now hiring back some fired officers.
But for somebody that's genuinely wanting to try again, that left on fairly mild issues that they promised to correct if they get another chance, well, we're glad to talk to those individuals.
The warden says they just need the help, but says no officer fired for a serious violation is being considered.
A contraband issue or involving abuse of an offender or involving a DUI or a drug problem on the street, that individual won't be invited back.
El Dorado has been short-staffed by more than 95 officers. Hiring back former officers, that's moved that number down to 75. But with some of those officers still working 16-hour shifts to keep the prison secure, they have an open invitation to officers fired for minor issues.
Typically, we will ask for a reference, if they've been working at another job and that's gone well. We ask for that, and we do follow up on that.
To keep officers who could be thinking of leaving, they're requesting funds for stab vest protection of all officers as they continue the search to fill 75 more officer vacancies.
Meanwhile, they're hopeful lawmakers will respond to the request for more funding. Outside El Dorado at the correctional facility, Craig Andrus, KSN News 3.
And again, that was Craig Andrus from our news partners at KSN with that report. And corrections is, especially the situation in El Dorado and the other prisons, something we've discussed in the show several times. And that money, as I'm continuing to get reports in from Topeka on the renewed budget debates going on there as we record the show, does appear to be in jeopardy at this point. They had put a bunch of more money in it, and it may not be there because of the fight earlier over Medicaid.
It is worrisome to hear that because, for one thing, we know that taking the budget back to committee is all about political pressure. It's not really about policy. But, as Jeff pointed out, there's a risk whenever you do something like this. Now, if you're talking about funding for higher education, if you're talking about funding for basic core services, I suspect that, the political blowback to taking apart a finely developed, negotiated conclusion would be pretty large. But taking money away from prisons, the fact is that prisons don't have a political constituency. You don't see large numbers of votes coming out of state penitentiaries. And so I do worry about that. I do worry that even though we hear these stories all the time about how they're struggling to find workers and how they're pushing to increase the pay of workers and how they're trying to improve safety for the workers, I still wonder if, in these negotiations, prisons might be on the bottom of the totem pole.
It sounds like they might be.
Yeah, historically they are. If you're faced in a tough budget environment and you have to pay for schools or prisons, we pick schools. If you have to pay for roads or prisons, we pick roads, and that's to your point because there's not a constituency, there's not an advocacy group, and there are not a lot of people out there advocating for better working conditions. Let's remind people, people who are working in correctional facilities, 16, 17-hour days, it's tough work, but it has to be done and it needs to be done well, and that requires paying people a reasonable wage in order to do that job for our state.
And I know that, out of the $30 or $35 million that Governor Kelly has proposed adding into the budget, part of that at least is going to be pay raises. I think it was reported to be somewhere in between 5 and 13%, which is significant if it happens.
Yeah, it's a significant percentage, but from a small starting pay rate. I think the people who work those jobs would say that that just begins to get them to a salary to go do the work we ask them to do every day.
Well, especially when they can go someplace else. They can go to the county sheriff's office and the county jail
And
or elsewhere or just another state
Right.
and make better money.
And you find law enforcement generally much more organized as a political force in Kansas than you do in terms of, penitentiary workers. And that's an unfortunate truth. I mean, there are people who advocate for them. There are those who, try to, herald the important, necessary work that they're doing in our society. But, those voices are pretty minor in comparison to others.
Yeah, the construction lobby advocating for roads.
That's
much more powerful.
That's
lobby.
a powerful voice.
That's exactly right.
Yeah, and sometimes that's what it comes down to, is who's got the loudest voice. Yeah. Well, one thing Kansas lawmakers did agree on this veto session was a bill saying Kansas children can't be the aggressors in sex crimes. This bill would prevent judges from lowering sentences for child sex offenders if they think the victims were willing participants in the crime. It comes in reaction to a Leavenworth County case earlier this year when a judge reduced the sentence of 67-year-old Raymond Soden because the judge thought that 13 and 14-year-old girls involved in the case were the aggressors. Current law allows judges discretion in sentencing for substantial or compelling reasons. This bill would prevent reduced sentences in cases of sexually violent crimes or electronic solicitation if the victim is under 14 and the offender is 18 or older. It's now headed to the governor's office. And this is a story that made national headlines when this ruling came down, and everybody was outraged that happened. I've talked to a lot of lawmakers who say we pass laws and oftentimes there are unforeseen circumstances when we have to pass trailers. Is this one of those situations, or is this something we should have realized?
Well, I don't know. I wonder some of this is kind of one-off in the sense that it is not common for judges to say that 13-year-olds are the aggressors in a case like this. And so I don't know if this is an unintended consequence. Giving some judges some discretion, the law, I think, said for substantial, and significant reasons. That's, I think, usually works out fine for us. In this case, it didn't, and so I'm not surprised, given the circumstances, that the state is correcting that.
I mean, I would have to actually read the trial report. I'm genuinely curious. Not that I really want to spend my time reading about such a creepy, evil individual, but I mean, honestly, what was the judge thinking? Was he imagining that these 13-year-old kids had been, plotting some kind of entrapment against?
It was an electronic solicitation case, and the girls allegedly reached out. More likely, it was whoever was controlling them reached out first.
Right.
But
yeah, I think the issue is essentially that they knew what was happening, but that all begs the question of whether 13 and 14-year-olds can know enough.
They're minors.
Well,
I mean, we don't put in the same.
Minors cannot give consent. So how can they be the aggressor?
We don't just we just don't have the same kind of legal procedures in place.
Yeah, they can't. And that's why with all all we've talked about is strategy and politics and what's good policy. But when things like this come up, we can get things like this fixed pretty quickly.
Yeah.
Well, fixed quickly it has been, and that is probably one of the few things that has been done so far in the veto session. Who knows how long that's going to go on, because it doesn't feel like it's going to end on Friday. So
could last a while.
It could last a while. Yeah, we could be looking at some overtime this year. Well, we do have one other thing to talk about: national politics in Kansas. There will be a change next year to how some voters pick their presidential candidate. The Kansas Democratic Party announced this week that it's moving from a presidential caucus to a presidential primary in 2020. In a caucus, voters have to be physically present for the entirety of the decision-making process, which can sometimes take several hours, usually lasting longer the more candidates there are. And there are currently 22 candidates for president in the Democratic Party. Also, at a caucus, voters have to make their choices publicly known. In a primary, they can vote in the privacy of the voting booth, spending no more time than it takes to wait in line. A primary will also allow mail-in early balloting for those who can't come to the polls on the day of the primary. The Kansas Democratic primary is now scheduled for May 2nd of next year. And I've got to say, as a journalist, I am fully in favor of give me a primary. I started my career covering politics in Iowa, where they had the first in the nation caucuses. I was never able to vote in the caucuses because, as a journalist, I need to keep my voting preferences quiet. In fact, there are some journalists who argue you shouldn't vote at all. But I'm not going to stand up in the middle of a group of people and say, yeah, I support this candidate.
Right.
I can't do that. And I know there are other people in other positions who feel the same way. So I'm in support of primaries over caucuses.
Honestly, I think all right thinking people should be. I respect, I mean, I study this, I teach this, and I respect the argument behind caucuses. But the argument for in-person voting stretched out over a significant period of time in a specific location, that's a product of a much more agrarian society. It's the product of a society when there's a lot less diversity in the voter pool, so that people who know each other, friends, associates, can get together and talk and work out who they want to vote for. That's not the society we live in. And so by imposing that model on a different kind of society, you are excluding people that don't have the time to spend 3 hours in a Saturday afternoon talking about who they prefer. They do have preferences. They want to be able to come in and vote, and hence a primary.
You know, I don't disagree with that, although I want to say there is something about people getting together in a room, standing up, giving speeches, persuading each other, particularly when there's maybe a limited number of candidates. And, you know, I'm thinking back to 2008 when you know, there were...
The Democratic caucus in 2008, Clinton and Obama.
Yeah, absolutely. And the opportunity for citizens at a local level to stand up and make the case for their candidate over another. There's, I agree with what you said, but there is something that's a little special about that as well.
And you're right, and we should find ways to not lose that. The ability of people to vocally, in-person participate with their fellow citizens in making choices is important. It's just organizing it around the selection of a major candidate of a major political party is no longer really functional. I mean, maybe that's a sad thing, but it is a reality.
Yeah, especially when we know, and this is a part of the party's argument for changing it, is that it disenfranchises people who just can't get to the caucus.
Poor people, people with limited mobility, people that are working multiple jobs.
Religious,
Jews religious
and
objections.
Adventists
Absolutely.
are cut out.
Yes,
and if it's on Saturday?
All of those reasons, the idea that, maybe to your point, that we figure out a way to energize people to speak up for their candidates and give people several days to vote when they can find a time that's convenient.
You find forums where you can do this.
All right, well, I'm going to have to cut you off there. Russell, Jeff, thank you so much for being here. I've enjoyed our conversation, and thank you for tuning in. We'd also like to thank our news partners at the Wichita Eagle, Cake News, and KSN News for sharing their materials with us. If you have any questions about this week's topics or would like to suggest a topic for us to cover, please email us at kansasweek@kpts.org. For now, have a great week.